Today, I'd like to welcome back JPStewart, PMP, back to the podcast. As the founder and owner of JPStewart Consulting LLC, he offers a wide range of consulting and training services to help organisations achieve their strategic goals, improve their performance, and deliver the right projects with the right resources. He's managed and supported projects in various domains such as IT, pharmaceuticals, and medical device, and he's created project management simulations and courseware for educational purposes. His mission is to help instill best practices and foster a culture of collaboration, innovation, and learning in project management. He provides coaching and training in Agile methodologies to help better deliver outcomes for patients and stakeholders. And he's got 20 years experience as a project manager and a Agile coach, and holds several credentials: PMP, CSM, PMI-ACP. He's also a co-author of a book, and we'll talk a bit about that today, and the reason that Jim's here. Great Meetings Build Great Teams, which talks about how to facilitate effective meetings in projects. So, Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nigel. And that guy sounds pretty impressive. I'd like to meet him. I should update the information. It's actually 25 years of project management, 10 years of Agile, I think about 10 certifications. The odd thing is that I was very happy with just PMP for years and years and years, and it wasn't until Agile came along I got different ones. So I think your introduction or your reading of my bio gave a pretty good idea. I've worked, like a lot of us, in full-time or organizations, but I'm working as an independent consultant for the past 20 years now. Which gives me, all that variety of stuff to do, more so than somebody who's working one organization. Pharmaceutical one time, IT another time, running projects, consult, all that stuff that you talked about. So I won't belabor that too much. I'm in the greater Boston area, and I have been talking about this, or wrote this book, the previous book we're talking about here, with my colleague Rich Maltzman, who isn't here today. He teaches at Boston University. He's doing that right now as we speak. So I'm somewhat speaking on his behalf. And we've known each other for a number of years, about as long as I have had my company. And we worked together a number of things, creating courseware and whatnot. And one day, he had written several books, and I said, why don't we write a book together? He said, somebody said to me, how about those big meetings you run? So I would co-facilitate 2-day planning meetings. And Rich and I, long story short, wrote a book on that. It was released several years ago and did okay. You don't put books like this out to become a millionaire, but it doesn't work that way. It's good collateral, good to do, publish or perish. And then we decided to update it to the latest version. I was telling Nigel before the call that the first one was more based around these big 2-day planning meetings. This one still has that, but based more around the remote world we find ourselves in post-pandemic, and those tools and the science of meetings. For me personally, I live here with my wife. My kids are moved out into Boston. I didn't realize it was in the picture. My wife moves things around in here in my office. Guitar in the corner. I play guitar as a hobby. Mostly rock and blues and stuff like that. The music that we invented here in the States and that the Brits took and perfected, quite frankly. If you took the British music out of my collection, it would be very poor. So thank you for that. So that's me kind of in a nutshell. And currently, I'm just to tell you what I'm doing now. I finished an Agile transformation project not too long ago in pharmaceutical, and I'm doing a few side projects. I'm coaching a woman at a company at a university that you would know, and I'm working on a simulation with a customer. Just finished a simulation where I'm the subject matter expert, and I'm also writing strategy guides and I also write PMP style questions for the PMP exam, not for PMI, but for some of their resellers. So that's sort of me in a nutshell. You can see the rest of my LinkedIn page. It's rather boring, I suppose.
Brilliant. That's brilliant. I notice, and I can't tell, I'm guessing it's rugby union. You've got your picture, or is it rugby league on your LinkedIn profile at the background?
I don't know which one it is, but are you an Agile guy? Are you an Agilist?
I am. I'm a Scrum Master and a Product Owner certified.
Right.
I haven't managed to use them in anger properly, but I kind of have an appreciation of some Agile stuff here.
So so you have the training and done. So the Scrum concept, just to talk about that for a minute, comes from rugby. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I don't know where exactly I got the picture. Probably borrowed it from the wrong place. But just that idea that there was an article written in the mid '90s in Harvard Business School. It was called the New Product Development, and they came up with the idea of a Scrum. So we have Scrum Masters, all that's Agile terminology, and so it seemed apt as much as anything else to put that picture up there. So that's the derivation of that.
I was wondering
Yeah.
whether it was that or whether it was with the Rugby World Cup on at the moment, whether it was something to do with that, but as well. So yeah.
The funny rugby is not unknown here in the States, but until you just told me there was a Rugby World Cup, I had no idea.
Yeah.
So we're just, if we're fanatical about anything, it's our version of football, but we don't follow all that. We don't even really follow your football as religiously as you folks do. We have it, but it's not on the level of baseball, our football, and those other sports. So it just hasn't been caught on. I don't know why.
Just the way it is, isn't it? The way it is.
Yeah.
It's interesting because obviously we mentioned there that you and Rich were on the show, and we were just looking back just before the call. Now, I think I put the episode out in July. I'm sure in July 2021. So I'm sure it was actually the conversation we probably had latter part of 2020. So obviously we were in the pandemic, probably deep in the pandemic at that time.
Yeah.
And still, I think, really at that point, adapting to dealing with this temporary change in the world. That, I think, our adoption of the remote working approaches were out of necessity rather than necessarily moving towards where we are now, which is becoming the hybrid approach and things like that is part of business as usual for a lot of us now. But it brings its own challenges. And I've, for many years, even before that, I've had teams where I haven't been physically located with them. I've had remote teams, I've had teams abroad, teams in different time zones. And there's always there was a difficulty in managing those teams because of that remoteness. And I know that I've had experience where going through all these different things of using video, not using video. Teams seems to be coming out, or teams are out, and all the different tools are coming out with new approaches to interact, and technologies just seems to be sort of rumbling on quite quickly still around the remote side. It's still not, it's still lagging behind that face-to-face communication of meetings. And it's not as bad as the sort of pre-COVID, where it was the conference call. No one was expected to be on video. It was a conference call, wasn't it? I remember the days when you'd have 30 people in the room and you're the one person in the car dialing in to give an update.
Nobody can hear you.
No one can hear you. You can't hear the person who sat at the far end of that desk who talks really quietly and looks down at their feet. And we're now in that situation with headsets on, and we're still learning that dynamic. What is it that... It's a really big question here, really. And it's kind of... I suspect there are fundamentals that we can apply across remote, in-person, hybrid meetings. What are the things that... What did you see that wasn't working that triggered you to enhance the book that you'd done before with, obviously, the planning meetings?
I listened to everything you said. I was really reflecting on that. I remember in 2020, I don't know how it was there. But there was a period of time where they told us not to leave the house at all because there was no vaccine. So we were literally stuck in the house. It might have been right around that time or shortly before or after. I think, first of all, I want to say one thing. I agree wholeheartedly that we will never... Maybe you didn't make the statement. Maybe you kind of were making it. We won't really replace face-to-face in person. It just can't happen because unless we get to holograms or some technology I can't foresee. But Project Management Institute and the Agilists both preach face-to-face is the best way. In person is the best way. So we do the best we can when we're not that. What happened during the pandemic in this, junior sociologist mind is that everything was brought forward many years. I'll give you an example of that, and I'll get to your sort of getting to your question. A friend of mine who I've met going to workshops, going to roundtables. I'm going to one next week. She runs one for project management offices, and she works at a major hospital in Boston. And she built the PMO, and she's a VP. She's been there for like 20 years, and that's her life. She told me when I last saw her that in 2020, I believe it was 2020, maybe 2021, she had plans to roll out the technology, remote technology, to doctors, nurses, the entire staff over the course of the year. Because of the pandemic, they rolled it out in a weekend. So, of course, then they were expected to roll everything out in a weekend. I said, well, wait, that was a special case. Telehealth was rolled forward a lot. I've been to telehealth doctor meetings and whatnot. So I think every time you read about something like a break, like a pandemic, it's a horrible situation that made other things better. Pandemics in Europe years ago, the Black Plague, health got better. They stopped throwing things out the window and whatnot, right? So health services got better. So I think in this case, we're in the middle of a quiet revolution. And I mean that in terms of businesses. My daughter works for a bio firm in Cambridge, Mass. And she was working like everybody else and then had to go home for a year and came back, and it was like a time capsule. Calendars from a year and a half ago on the wall. Half filled cups of coffee, like it had been abandoned like a nuclear war or something. So she came back from that, and now she's at a 3-day in, 2-day home, or vice versa situation. And there are companies here that are saying, you must come back in full time or you won't work here anymore. And a lot of the employees are saying, I will go work someplace else. So we're in the middle of this quiet revolution of the quiet quitting, people making decisions to find out they can be more productive. My customer, who I'm also on the board of his training company, they write all courseware and simulations and online things. When I would go visit them in a small office several years ago, there were 20 people always there. When I go in now, it's a ghost town. When the pandemic hit, they went for home. He and everybody else got much more productive. Even the CEO was convinced. He has a 2-hour commute to the office he doesn't have to make anymore. That's 4 hours a day or whatever. So when we wrote the first book, we had one of our friends, a guy named Wayne Termel, who's written books on distance learning with him. Could you write a chapter for us on remote? Not that we didn't know, but you're kind of the expert here. And I've been asking about, and I'm leading up to the answer here, remote tools to do, stickies, post-it notes across there. We didn't have much on that. A couple of years later, well, where was Zoom then? I knew of Zoom because the others was using it. Zoom is a big deal now. Teams is a big deal for remote. You're using something, Riverside. So with all these things have gotten better in quality. I could hardly find anything other than the WebEx or whatever to use to do what we're doing here. Zoom is here. Miro has come along. So from a technology point of view, Miro allows me to use sticky notes, post-it notes across there, share things. I can do Agile ceremonies. I've got other tools I can do that with. So in a very short time, answering your question on 2 levels, technology-wise, we've vastly improved our tools. Society-wise, we're still adjusting because people are somewhat going in the office, not going in the office. It's having ramifications. A lot of the restaurants in downtown Boston that open for lunch are closed because there's nobody there to have lunch. So we have social ramifications. Companies are still working out. They're very much in what we call some of them are in a theory X mode. You must be here so I can see you working. Transitioning to a theory Y mode of you can work from home and get things done. So I think the technology is happening, the mindset is shifting, and I think we're past the point where everybody got on the Zoom and said, oh, it looks like the Brady Bunch. And so it's a generation getting used to it. After a while, it's nothing. My wife is a teacher, did training that way with kids. And I think the biggest adjustment is people, and we talk about this in the book, adjusting to technology. So if this is the way we're going to work, don't stare at yourself on the camera all day long. You don't carry a mirror around all day long and look at yourself and deal with things like Zoom fatigue, which is a real thing. So I think what I've seen, to answer your question, that's a long way of answering it, is changes in society, changes in technology, trying to somewhat keep up with it, the knowledge that face-to-face is still best. But this is the brave new world, and we need to adjust to it and do what you and I are doing right here. And I think it's my observation. on working this way for the past couple of years. I've hardly gone into an office. I work great this way in the pharmaceutical. I did a project in the Middle East for 4 months without leaving this office, and it worked. So it's doable. And then there were cultural things, although it turns out the guys I was working with were techies in the Middle East. Well, techies are the same. It turns out. So whatever
Yeah.
cultural differences we had were wiped away. So I'm not sure if that addresses your question, but I hope it does. It's just, we're in the middle of something. We're not. We don't. The jury is out on how well
Mm.
this will all work. In my opinion.
Yeah. I kind of concur with that, and it's quite interesting actually that culture thing is that I'm seeing it myself is that culture shift is
Yeah.
hard and uncomfortable for everyone from a leadership point of view, as in CEO leadership, where you've got, as you say, some of the big organisations going right. You've got to be in every day
Right.
because there's twofold there. The roles that some of these people are involved in benefit from that close collaboration,
Mm.
that proximity to others for part of their job. I'm not convinced for the whole of the job, but part of it.
Yeah.
And then the other side of it is new to organisation, whether that be completely new to an organisation or new into the workplace. I'm an old git. I've worked at the place I'm at for 18 years now.
Mm.
I have a really strong network in the area that I work.
Right.
You build that up. We've got people who join the organisation who have been there 2 weeks. I was talking to some who just under 2 weeks. They know no one.
Mm.
And if they're in the office, if they're not in the office, they'll meet like this. Actually, if people don't turn on the video, they don't meet that person. And even then, it's weaker than if you're physically meeting the person. And that culture of people feeling what the culture of the organisation is goes away. They don't get that
Right.
feeling unless they're together.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I know that a lot of companies are struggling with, right, how do you do that? How do you get that engagement? How do I sell it to someone like me who can pick up the phone to anyone in our organisational hierarchy and find someone senior enough to get down to get somewhere, or
Right.
someone who's down in the weeds and can fix something and point me in the right direction? I can find someone. So what's the benefit of me driving for 40 minutes, an hour, having a wash, getting dressed, looking tidy, and
Right.
and heading in there, because I can do everything here in quotes. But
Yeah.
I've kind of it's kind of being a bit selfish and selfless in some ways. You need to build to be, I think, is that you can go in and go, right. So I'm there for someone.
Yep.
Like I was having a session with someone today we were chatting away, and they were doing something. It was on Excel or something like that. And I said, "Do you know you can do that or something? A little shortcut." And they're like, "Well, no, I never knew that." Now I wouldn't have seen the fact that they were doing that on their keyboard
Right.
unless I was stood next to them. And
Right.
just a little thing, it's saving a couple of seconds. But it's those keyboard shortcuts that you grew up in the late 80s, early 90s using because mouse technology wasn't amazing. You ended up that's the way you needed to do it.
Right.
And you kind of
Right.
got those things you can give to people. And I wouldn't be able to give that and help that person speed up what they're doing and build that relationship with them. So I've committed earlier in the year to being at least once a week, sometimes twice a week, into my office local to me, but not just for me, but for being there for other people as well. And I definitely and I kind of see that as being very much a meetings day, and this is kind of where it comes round to of what I don't want to be in remote meetings. I want to be in face-to-face meetings with people, building relationships, building rapport,
Agreed.
having a whiteboard to scribble on together,
Exactly.
and with a big monitor up there. And I think there's a culture, but then we've got to flip it on the head and go, right, okay, if we've got a big meeting and we've got a regular team meeting, how do we make sure that you don't have 4 people in a room and the whole conversation sticks on them and that 6 people on the telly feel unrepresented? With those scenarios, what do you see as what are the kind of tips that you see from there, and the kind of
I want to go back a
not
step.
giving away the whole book, but I'm guessing
No,
there's
and
some
by
of that
the
in
way,
there.
by the way, I will, because if I'm not stopped, if Rich were here, we would. There are people who have asked
Okay,
us.
so just read out chapter 1 for us then.
Yeah, I'll read the whole book.
What I'll do, I'll just stick this on the Patreon's page, and I can sell it on to make the money off the back.
There you go. We'll split the proceeds. I'll tell everything, but So I just want to go back a step on a couple. You're right, because Boston is now the biotech. We have 1,000 biotech companies. We're the biotech capital of the world. Yeah. And part of the reason for that, the universities and the hospitals and whatnot, but also companies that have moved here because they had like the innovation. They can walk out their door and meet other people. So they still need to do that. No argument. And I'm not a defender of one must work at home at all times. In my pharmaceutical case, I worked for the better part of a year, and my boss said, I was a contractor or a consultant. She said, you need to be here to meet with XYZ people. But she didn't say be here 5 days a week. So we sort of felt it out. And it became a situation of, well, who are these people I need to... So I would do things like, you'll enjoy this. We're in a suburb, not in Boston. And I would say, I'd go in. And I said to somebody, we can have the meeting, knowing my boss would only be there, have the meeting in the office. She said, I don't care if we can do it from remote. So I kept trying to have in-person meetings with people who were remote. So I'd be going in the office, and they'd all be remote. So it took a while to figure out how often do I need to be. And like you said, the guy I was working with, that was my boss, but there was a guy who was the product owner of the entire transformation. I knew that when he was in, I wanted to be in a lot of the time. We would go to a room, meet, and go to the whiteboard. He was a real good drawer. He's from not being facetious. He drew things out. He was very good at explaining to me how pharmaceutical worked. He would explain the drug thing to me that I needed to understand to a certain extent. He could have done it online, but they were great in person. But what I'm saying is, before I get to your question about the other question is the companies and individuals have to work out. You worked out your situation. You want to be in a day or two a week, whatever, so you can, I won't say mentor, but be there for those other people. I worked that. And I finally realized what my boss was talking about. She wanted me to be there, especially for the lab people. We're going to work with lab people. So, but that didn't happen to the end of my tenure. So I worked that out. The other thing I wanted to say that came to mind was the generational thing about this technology. And I'm not somebody that says, my generation is great, yours is bad. But interestingly, the older generations get the harder time they have adapting to this technology. And it isn't just people who are older than me. I'm a baby boomer. My daughter tells me, who's a millennial, that I'm one of the relatively few baby boomers, because I have an IT background, that is comfortable with the technology. She tells me astonishingly, a lot of my peers barely know how to turn the thing on. But then you have, like my kids, millennials are comfortable with every kind of technology. Oh, you have to download this, and by the time you tell them, they've done it. So I want to get that generational thing out of the way. Your question was about these meetings where some people are remote, some are not remote. We talk about this, and this actually came from our guy, Wayne, who said to keep the people who are not in the room in the room. For example, tell them they don't have to necessarily mute themselves unless they've got the toilets flushing or they're cooking something or whatever. So they're online. Make them feel like they're part of it. So if you and I, Nigel, were in a room together with 3 or 4 other people, and we had one guy who was remote, make sure he's involved or she's involved. It's a woman. And so it's like, leave your line open. We'll chat things. We'll make sure we'll refer to you periodically. We'll show you things. Make sure that you're engaged in it. I think, though, that has become less of a problem in my observation than it was 3 or 4 years ago, especially when we had those speaker phones. We call those spider phones. Those speaker phones, and there was everybody now. People can sit in their car, and I've done it on Zoom on their phone. So I think it's up to the meeting leader, because it's always his or her ownership, to make sure the other people feel engaged, and it's up to the people who are remote to make sure that they are engaged. But I personally think, and I can be a one-man data point on this, that it's become easier to involve them because the technology is better. There's no excuse for not being able to Zoom in this and that. And by the way, I always encourage people not to. I can't stand when I get in a meeting and say, "Oh, can everybody bring their camera up? We want to see you." maybe I'm having a bad hair day, as we call it. Some people don't want to be on camera. So they might come on, hi, I'm Jim, I'm Mary, etc. I'm not going to be on camera. Fine, turn it off. Maybe turn it off when you're speaking. Turn your camera off so you're looking at yourself all the time. So I think a cognizance of, on the meeting leaders front, people don't want to be on camera all the time. Let them not be on camera. 2, make sure that they're engaged in the conversation, that they're there, they're present, feel like they're part of it. And 3, I think make sure that the technology is good. You've tested technology, it works. You share information. I think if you do all that, I think if you engage people and give them a reason to be there, they're going to drop off if you're not keeping them. I don't want to use the word entertained, but I almost said entertained. And
Yeah.
so if my meeting is boring, that's why I'm going to hear clicking on the keyboard because they may be doing something else anyway. But I need to engage them somehow by bringing them in as part of the discussion. What do you think, Nigel? What do you think, Ted? What do you think? Engage them like that. If you don't engage them, their mind's going to drift. That's true of people in physical meetings and remote meetings. And also, you as a leader need to remember about things like Zoom fatigue. Are people tired from that? And maybe give them more frequent breaks than you might give it an in-person thing. We're 45 minutes in. Let's take 10 minutes. Things like that. I think that helps a lot. I think we're in a better place than we were. It will
Yeah,
never
I'd
be
agree.
solved to the level you'd like. It'll never be perfect. People will drift.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's funny. We were talking about uh, where I am. There's this engaging people in a hybrid scenario, getting people involved is something that we're trying to improve on.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was, and this is a group of project managers. This is,
Yeah.
and one of the things that was suggested is that we should adopt this isn't a policy, but it's kind of adopt the policy of the approach of video first as an organisation to help. Like, there are situations where we know there are people who've been involved in the organisation and they have a manager who didn't turn on the video and they didn't have an avatar picture of them. So the person who is working for them, I'm not sure if it was an actual in our area or somewhere, had never met, didn't even know they could walk past them in the street and wouldn't have a clue that was their manager. And it kind of, there's a couple of pennies dropped in there, and it was, the challenge was put there, and some people come back with the challenge of, well, the thing is, we've got people walking behind me, I've got different situations, and it's like people realising that, like, we use Teams, and Teams has the blur facility to blur your background or your backgrounds, and we've got corporate backgrounds to use and things like that, and people hadn't actually realised they could do that, and that was a big one. That was recently in the last couple of weeks that someone's spotted that, and that conversation's obviously been going on at different times, and people have been resistant to put on the camera because of that situation.
I see.
But it was because they didn't know how to use the technology,
Right.
And so that again, if there's project managers listening there and they're struggling to get people to turn on the cameras and be able to see them and build that rapport, or anyone who's listening to it, if you're using products like Teams, or even not, ask the people. That's what I took when I did my book on remote thing, where the bit 1 page on remote working that I did. The thing is, the most important thing I thought was asking, and we all forget that. If someone hasn't got the camera on, don't assume they're just being grumpy. Don't assume they're just deciding they want to do something else and they're watching the cricket or the rugby on the telly. Ask them, what? I notice you don't have your camera on there. Why not?
Right.
And when you ask someone that, they turn around and say, I've got a pile of washing behind me, and do you know what I mean? A view of a really horrible building, or so. And it's kind of, okay, and that means they don't know how to use the blurring, they don't know how to use the background and green screen stuff, and so
education.
Use that education,
But
you don't know unless you ask.
Right.
And I do. It's funny actually. We have a regular meeting, and off the back of this session where we said to do it, we've all started doing it a bit more. And I have an update meeting where the team update me, and I kind of gather the latest project updates for the 5, 6, 7 projects, and everyone will have the video on today. I started with mine on. They'd already started with theirs on. Everyone had theirs. One of the guys said, I'm going to turn my video off. I can't be doing looking at myself. And that's fine. The idea was video on first. Hi, I'm here. Because then people know who you are, because your avatar doesn't look like you. You get a chance. It builds better, stronger relationships. But accept the fact that some people say, I don't want it on today. Yeah, I'm like you say, I'm having a bad hair day. Yeah. I'm really fatigued. I hate looking at myself. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I'm looking at you now. I have to move my screen around so you're in front, just above my camera. So I'm trying to look down the lens of the camera instead of me doing that and looking at me because I'm so handsome. That it's irresistible.
Resist yourself.
Yeah, exactly. But it is distracting, isn't it? Because you sit there and you go, "What am I putting that face for?" And you're going like that, and then it distracts you.
That's a different topic. So topic one is, I like the idea, ask people to come on camera, first couple of meetings, maybe they'll stay on it, and then they can even drop off when two other people talk and come back on. But the subject of your own camera, like I said, now I'm looking at myself here, I'm so used to it, but, turn yourself off, do the self view off, because we don't walk around all day looking at ourselves in a mirror. And this is what's caused people to become self-conscious. So what I do is I turn my self view off and I turn it on every 10 minutes or so to make sure I'm not slumping like this. I'm slumping and I didn't realize it. I've gotten very comfortable half asleep. So I think that etiquette of that is important. And I think it's really incumbent upon teams to understand, like you said, how to use the technology, and like I've been saying, the existence of things like Zoom fatigue and people, there's even one of the things in the Zoom fatigue. We didn't write this article. We have the link in the book somewhere about how people this restricts our mobility. I mean, we'd be sitting anyway, but perhaps we're in a meeting. Sometimes people get up and they go to the whiteboard, they'll walk around. Some of us might walk over here to get a soda or something. So there's a lot of features to that make it difficult to do it this way. And I think if people are educated, companies have education around the tools they're using, not just, here's a tool. There was a tool, I'm trying to remember the name of it now. I knew it well a couple months ago, and they were using it. We were working with France, and they were using a particular tool. It was like, here it is. Can I learn how to use it? And then they expect everybody to know it. People need some kind of education, because every tool, this one is probably different from Teams, from Zoom, etc. I don't know where all the buttons and switches are, right? So I think people know how to use it. And I think sometimes, too, I just thought of something when you're talking about, I've had teams where I say, Mary, just picking that out of the air, would you mind running the meeting this week? And no, okay. It gives them a cognizance of what's involved. And they might sit there and say, is Jim listening? So everybody in a team eventually gets a chance to run it, if they're at that level of how hard is it to do it. Find out what it's involved in running a meeting, so they're cognizant of how they come across in that too. If you're comfortable having people run it, it's not always the case. I think, though, everybody should know how to run a meeting. If I have somebody in my team who's unwilling or unable to run a meeting, I'm concerned about their growth, because it's fundamental, again, to be able to do it. If they can't run a meeting, I'm not saying I'd fire them. I'm just saying I would get them to be the point where they can run a meeting. As somebody who has trained a lot of project managers, over thousands project managers, PMP training and whatnot, you'd be astonished perhaps. So, by the way, Rich and I very much think of running a class like a meeting, because it is. It's a meeting where we have to I have a 4-day PMP class. I got to make sure that all the techniques that I talk about I use. I've got to control what we call the goblins. I've got to facilitate, keep things on time, etc. So you'd be amazed at the number of students that I have who are professional project managers. I might have 15 in a class. I've had 30, whatever. These are relatively small, not hundreds. When they raise their hand, ask a question, they ask it like this. Their voices don't project beyond their nose. I'm thinking, how does this person ever get up in front of a steering committee and present? And if they don't, in the world of project management, which is more strategic, you've got to do that. I want all my project managers who've had a team to have the ability to run a meeting, to present to a board, which is a meeting, to run a status meeting, to run Azure meetings. I want them to be large and in charge. We talk about that. So I think that's, for me, a skill I'd also always want to cultivate in my teams, is the ability to speak professionally, to run meetings and to learn it, and not to worry if they don't I had one guy I was coaching. He ran a retrospective in Agile. Between us, he did a pretty horrible job, but it was his first one. So I coached him afterwards, and he just got better at it. He coached people, and then I've had the fantastic event of coaching people on running meetings and running out of things to say because they were doing it so well. They took my advice and gave me some advice of their own. One meeting. So to give you one example of the most mundane thing, right? I think you and I talked about this a little bit about little gains, kaizen, small change. So there were two women in the pharmaceutical, one up in Canada, who was the product owner for this particular line of pharma, and then a woman in the PMO who was her scrum master running her meetings. Now, why is a woman who runs the PMO also being a scrum master, which is not as lofty a position? Because they were short on scrum masters. They were a dynamic team. They were a really good team. They were our gold standard Agile team, except for one problem. Their meetings always went over. They had an hour meeting once a week to discuss all the various features of this drug they were developing. And I would come on as an observer. I wouldn't typically say a word unless they addressed me. And afterwards, I would send them a note via Teams or I write them an email. And I said, it appears that all your meetings are running 10, 15 minutes over. Yeah, what can we do about that? I said, has it occurred to you that you start 10 minutes after the hour? That you come on at 8 o'clock, you talk for 2 minutes, and you wait for everybody to show up. You're always starting 10 minutes late. I said, how about this as a radical idea? Start on time, or as close to on time as you can, say 2 minutes after the hour. People will get that idea. They'll catch up later. You've got cards on your Agile board, your task board, that tell what happened, or they can update later. They started doing that, and they started ending on time. There was no genius thing in that. It was just I was an observer that saw what they couldn't see, and they instantly said, of course. So those small little things. See, the beauty part about Agile, we fix one thing at a time. We do a retrospective. I'm not selling it, just saying. That was the thing they fixed that week. That guy in the retrospective, in a retrospective, you say, what went well, what didn't go so well, what can we improve? He spent most of the hour, whatever the time was, reading the things that went well, reading them from the spreadsheet. I said, next time, just say quickly what went well, keep it brief, and then focus on what didn't go well and what you can improve. You've done what went well, applause, applause. Focus on this, focus on this. He was able to do that small change. Don't try to reinvent the wheel or, as we say, boil the ocean in one thing. We're going to fix all our meetings in the company. Fix one thing at a time. Fix one small thing at a time. It'll get better.
I think and I think it is a thing that I've seen and I've heard others recount it as well, as around change fatigue, and during the whole that pandemic era, there's been leading up to that, we had digital transformations going on and lots of things changing and things like that. So a lot of change on change anyway, social change, socio-economic change. And then obviously with the pandemic and everything that's happened since then, there is a continued acceleration and an increase in the amount, and we're in this VUCA environment. It's funny actually, because in the November of 2019, I went to a PMI event in the UK down. It was their 50th anniversary celebration event, and it was all around volatile, uncertain, complex, and
right. Sure.
I always forget the A, whatever the A is. Anyway, the VUCA. Yeah. So essentially, it was about the fact that everything was a bit wild, a bit uncertain, and a bit crazy, and then suddenly in March, it made that look like everything was bleeding organised, and then it's continued after, isn't it? The rise of generative AI and things like that, which we'll talk about AI and using in the meetings in that as well in a little bit.
Sure.
Because that's something that's obviously, again, that is changing day on day. In fact, I saw something today, Ricardo Vargas put in his predictions for the next 6 months on LinkedIn of what's going to happen with some of the generative AI. And he says not because he knows what's going to happen, it's just his gut feel of what's going to happen, and he's going to, for interest, have a look next year because I think the latest thing is that ChatGPT has just hooked it in so that it's going to be up to date information. It's going to be pumping out rather than archive information or historic information sort of thing. So immediately you get the challenge of more up to date information in there, which again is a bit of a game changer for that. But
Yeah.
it just it's funny, a couple of things you're saying there about people getting up and wandering around. We the session I was talking about before we had earlier today, we were playing around with backgrounds because again, the guys are kind of we're kind of experimenting with the video. I discovered something, the together mode on Teams that you get where you can have it as if it's an auditorium. We were playing with that in a session the other day. Me mainly because I saw it and I thought, I wonder if this will make it. I'll change it and I'll look at everyone like that today because there was quite a few people on. And then I didn't realise it changed for everybody on the call. So it just suddenly completely changed. So distracted. I said, apologies.
Right.
But then I said, oh, there's a button there. I can turn it off and just do it for me. And then I saw another button that said custom backgrounds. I clicked that and it took me off to a Microsoft thing. I could create my own. So essentially it's got this template, which is like a PowerPoint slide sort of thing, but you have avatars for the number of people that you have in a meeting, and then you can create a scene and then place them where you want to. So I did the Muppets. So I created Waldorf and Statler, several Waldorf and Statler things, and then just had put them there while we were on the meeting, and then popped it up there. It was kind of one of the, when you grab something, you think, oh, let's play with that.
Now, did everybody see? Was everybody else ever able to see that?
Yeah.
Did you put it? So that's fun. I mean, that's the other thing is like, your people, icebreakers, fun things. They don't have to be death marches, these meetings, right? I mean, I talked about starting that meeting on time. I didn't mean to say to them, hi, how are you doing? Or how was your weekend? But you have to go through that kind of quickly. Of course, cultures are different. There's one thing we mentioned. There's one of your fellow countrymen, Richard Lewis, wrote a book called When Cultures Collide. And it was recommended to me by a student, and we quote that in there. They talk about how meetings in Germany and I think the UK and the US start more or less on time. And by the time you get to Spain and Italy, it's sort of like 20 minutes of meandering, and eventually we'll get around to it, right? That's not a joke. That's just the way it is. So you have to acclimate yourself to the culture. So let me say, for those of you who are perhaps watching this from other cultures, here in the U.S., we're going to try to start it near as on time. That's neither right nor wrong. It just is. If I come to work if I go to work in Japan, there's formal ceremony and everything starts when the senior person says we start. So I'm cognizant of that as well. So I want to temper that by saying my advice might be different in a different culture. But in the U.S. culture, and we were working U.S. and Canada, it was pretty much the same at least as far as that was. I didn't see too much between U.S. and Canada as far as different cultural stuff. So I just want to throw that in too, that it's not a one-size-fits-all statement.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is we've got to look at cultures. You mentioned cultures earlier when you were working with some people in the Middle East and the fact that they were techies and therefore you had that culture. So I think the thing is culture. There's culture and there's culture, isn't there? There's
organizational culture, Yeah,
you've got organizational culture, you've got nationality culture, you've got community culture, you've got the as you say, the techie culture. You might have a marketing culture, you might have an engineering culture, and like you say, the biopharmacists. Or there will be a culture in those that you can't just sit there and go, because that's in Boston, that's the culture of these type of people. There'll be subcultures, isn't there? And it is literally a subculture within, and they collide as well, don't you? You'll have, depending on what's happening, the one person may apply a different behaviour depending on which community / culture they're in at that time. So if they're in just the marketing group, or if they're in the wider organisation, they might behave differently.
If speaking of national culture, when I was working with the Middle East, I had never worked or been. I still haven't been there. I read some books, talked to some people, and my number one prime directive was not to offend anybody, and by doing the wrong thing. For example, I happen to know, maybe that if you show the bottom of your shoe in Saudi culture or Arabian culture, it's an insult. So, not that I would have the opportunity to, but that was the idea. Now, I got to talking to the guy who was the director of the IT there. He would send me WhatsApp messages. Like he did. He sent me a WhatsApp message, and I said, okay, whatever response. He eventually sent me a thumbs up, and I said, oh, okay, thumbs up is okay. So we use that. But going back to the meeting thing, we would be on calls. And the reason I mentioned techie because I came from 15 years as a network engineer prior to being in project management. we'd have these calls, these meetings to discuss setting up the project management office. That was why I was there. And he had two senior guys, a bunch of network people. It was always this two senior guys and him. And we'd be on Zoom or Teams or whatever. And while we were on it, he had on the, I don't know what to call it, a costume, the traditional garb that they wear to work. And he'd say, excuse me, he'd be on the phone talking to a vendor, arguing with a vendor while we're having this meeting. I thought, this is no different than if I was talking to an American guy, other than it's a different culture. He was just like, it didn't, none of that mattered. It's funny how, so our engineering culture was very similar. He was a guy with a couple of guys, with a couple of people trying to get stuff done, networks rolled out, telecommunications done, and I respected their culture. I'm sure they respected mine. Even when I gave the final presentation, you could hear a pin drop because they just, what I was told was things like, culturally, with things like, make sure you say, and Jim recommends X, because they respect the consultant or whatever it might have been. That's off the topic of meetings. But yeah, it's important. I don't want to go too far into what's important for you as a project manager. We're not here to talk about it as such. But if you're meeting, I'll give you a story from the book. We solicited war stories from people on LinkedIn, which I wish we had thought to solicit from you. Next edition, we'll get one from you. I'm sure you have 100 of them. War stories were stories where things went horribly well or horribly wrong. For example, what my friend in Boston who has, I'll get to the cultural one in a second, who did the project management office. I forget the exact details. One of her project managers was on a call and got lost in cyberspace. So in a breakout room, wound up staying in the breakout room, couldn't get back to the main room, lost the entire meeting based on that, like a Black Mirror episode or something. That was that, right? And then the cultural one that Rich came up with, which was a bunch of guys or people visiting Japan. And there's a very formal greeting card thing, I believe. The greeting card or the business card represents you. It is you in a sense. And one of the guys saw this gleaming table and couldn't resist taking his card and skimming it across the table. And the Japanese were horrified. I would be anyway in the States, but it was double that in Japan. It was a complete insult for him to do that. He was non-cognizant of the culture. So I think working internationally and meeting internationally, and by the way, when we work internationally, we're mostly going to meet internationally. We're not going to go over the wealth of things that we're going to meet. Respect the culture. Know the culture you're going into. And I say that whether it's me going over to the Middle East or me going to, say, Alabama. You know, you may not know the differences here, but in the North, the north of the United States, we are a lot more, we're not as friendly. We're not as sociable as the Southerners say. I just came off of a cruise recently, a lot of Southerners. They're so warm and friendly. There's differences among us between the North and the South, but the Southerners are more, how you doing? How's it going? Do you want some iced tea? There's just a casual neighborliness that they have that we, especially in the Northeast, if you go from the New York to Boston to Washington, D.C. corridor, we don't have time for pleasantries. It's all, let's just get business. We're not unfriendly. We're just not, New York doesn't have time for that. So I have to acclimate, if I work or teach in the South, to that level of neighborliness. I remember I taught in Indianapolis. I was doing a meeting, a class. A lot of the people that's the center of the country, Midwest-ish, Indiana. A lot of people were driven up from Kentucky. Boy, could they talk. They'd come back from lunch, and they were all socializing. I had to all but get a whip to get them back into the meeting because they were socializing and whatnot and having a good time. So, yes, organizational culture is important. This is why I say this stuff is so fundamental. I mean, if I'm going to hire somebody to run my project and they say, I have 10 certifications like you do, Jim. I know Microsoft Project like the back of my hand, and I'm an Agilist and I know Jira. And I say, yeah, but can you talk to people? Can you communicate with people? Can you talk to stakeholders? Can I trust you? That's what I care about. I kind of don't much give a damn about your certifications. I want to know, do you have soft skills, what they call power skills now in PMI. So I think those are important. And by the way, as I think about it, either I make these things up as I go along or they pop into my head as we're talking. I think those are much more needed the way we're doing it now because you can't see my body language. I taught PMP for 9 years for whatever reason, remote, two different customers, and I never set foot inside of a class. When that ended and I set foot in the class, I said, this is so much better. When I explained concepts like earned value or critical path, people doing this, right?
People sitting on,
Or what? Exactly. Now, if there's 10 people on the screen, I can't see them all. Some of the cameras are off, but I can feel the energy in the room too.
yeah,
I would, in the previous classes that I had, I would get to quality. No offense to quality people, but I know quality reasonably well, and I found this interesting part of it. A lot of people just fall asleep during it. We were getting there at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the second day of a brain dump from me to them. They'd be, so I would have to say, let's take a break. That's harder to see on the remote. So I think we have to have better antenna on remote because we just don't see everything.
yeah. I think it's sometimes.
But, yeah.
No, I get that. I think it's that. It's funny. It's some of the discipline of running meetings, and I had listening to and meetings are such a big thing of what we do, and everybody said this meeting could have been an email. So I mean, it's kind of all these sort of things, which is great because I wouldn't have read the email if someone had sent it. So you know what I mean. So then I'd have nothing to do in those scenarios. So that's where I end up with that. I think, yeah, if it's been an email, I'm unlikely to read it. So therefore, it's even less effective than a meeting in my mind. But and I think the thing is it's a communication, and it's a communication tool. It's one of the millions of communication tools, and it is the most effective. Face-to-face meeting is the most effective if it's done right.
Right.
If it's done poorly, it can be the biggest waste of time you can imagine, and that's
right.
That's the problem, isn't it? Because an email, you can do it really quickly and really ineffectively, because you have no control over, and there's laughing in the background of my children who are know I've got a podcast on, and they seem to be entirely silent except for when I start recording.
Right.
So I'll have some conversations with them later. It doesn't always pick up because this microphone's directional, but even so, it distracts me. Sorry about me looking away to that one. Bo and Bonnie, you're getting a call out on the podcast that you're being a pain in the backsides. So I'll tell them that I've done that now.
They'll show up later on.
Yeah, they will, yeah. And I've lost my train of thought, except that I was going, yeah, the fact that, and I remember it's the Manager Tools podcast, which is one of my favourite podcasts from a point of view of learning stuff. And actually Wayne Tamel's one was one of my early podcasts that I used to listen to. What was it? The something middle manager, wasn't it? The Grouchy middle manager, or something like that.
I haven't listened to it. I only know him through Rich and through his book. I don't know his podcast.
Yeah, it was a big podcast guy. Yeah, it's quite a long time ago that he did that podcast, but it was one of the early ones I listened to. But the thing that they say in the Manager Tools one was around planning a meeting, having an agenda, setting expectations, controlling the meeting, thinking about what you're going to do, keeping to the agenda, the timings of the agenda, all these things that whether it's face-to-face, whether it's remote, poor meetings tend to be ones that don't have that kind of structure.
Right.
Now, you have some meetings that are kind of updates, and that's kind of okay. They can be a bit of meandering, because some people, they need a little bit more longer, some people don't. But then the difficulty might be that you've got a talker like me, who's going to take 15 minutes to tell you what you could have told you in 5, and someone who's after me, who really wants to get out that meeting quickly because they've got to drop to a client meeting or something like that and would like to give their updates and then excuse themselves. But so again, the more structure you put into those meetings, now sometimes you need to add that flexibility. And like you said there, it's about thinking about the purpose of the meeting, thinking about the outcome you want for the meeting, and thinking about the people in the meeting, what their input and what their output is, which takes time and effort, which we don't always do. And that's the thing that I think, how do you see that on that preparation for meetings?
You know, it's interesting. I have a lot to say about this, but I'll try to condense it. First of all, a person might be taking notes saying, if I have an agenda, if I have objectives, if I invite the right people, if I have action items, I will have a great meeting. There's an important ingredient missing: them. So I'm going to give you an interesting example. A young lady called me up, contacted me through my website. Oh, it must be 10 years ago now. Her project management office had been dissolved because a project had failed. Therefore, they blamed the discipline of project management. I won't even get into that. The only two people who were
I'm sorry.
right.
Yeah.
So the only two people who were left.
Right, we're not going to use hammers anymore because we bent the nail.
Exactly. So the only two people left were her boss, the director, and her. She wanted me to come in and help revitalize the PMO. So we talked about slides I would do, presentation I would do, and I came in into. Interestingly, as a side note, some of it was remote, and it was long enough ago that we were walking over to some camera and holding up our laptop to show people who were remote. Right, ridiculous stuff, but that worked to some extent. I did my thing. I gave my talk. Now, I wasn't there to mentor her. That wasn't my job. I was there on her request to help rebuild interest in the PMO. I did my talk, and then I sat down, and she wanted to say something. She talked in such a monotone that I observed that people were, this will happen, drifting away, starting to talk to each other. They had started to tune her out. And it wasn't like, let's talk because she's boring. They just started to naturally talk to each other. So if you have to have all that right, but you have to be interested in what you're talking about and be interesting and get people's attention. The other thing I tell people is, if you're not, get presentation skills. I went to a presentation class back in 1990 in Chicago or someplace. Oh, you're jingling the keys in your pocket. You're boring, this and that. It's hard because they'll video you, but that's what you want. And to learn. Now, I've honed whatever I can do to speak from years of teaching. Some people will say they're an introvert. Guess what? So am I. Don't use that as a crutch. I don't care if you're an introvert. Yeah. Too bad. You need to get up and speak. You need to speak clearly and convey what you're trying to say. You need to be interesting to your crowd. So you can have all those things in place, being an interested and interesting speaker. Now, I'm going to save your viewers money on buying the book if they want to buy it. The two biggest pieces of advice in the book. So one is a corollary with what I just said. Be large and in charge. It's our meeting, but you're running it. There's only one person in charge of the meeting. It's the project manager. If the meeting fails, or a series of meetings fail, then if I'm running it, I can go home and say to my wife, I ran these meetings today, and Joe hijacked, and Nigel kept talking, and this other guy kept interrupting. And, if I didn't have them, I'd be fine. And she would be right to say, weren't you running it? Or my boss would say, weren't you running it? Yeah, but what could I do? Well, there must have been some strategy to keep these people from distracting you. So you need to be large and in charge. Now, here's the number one piece of advice. I'm going to back into it. There's a consultant named Alan Weiss. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's an interesting guy. Alan is the kind of consultant, he didn't do this exactly, but I'll give you the type of level of consultant he is. He's the kind of guy they would have gone to one day and said, Steve Jobs is leaving the company. We need to find a replacement. He works at that kind of level. Okay? Or worked. He then wrote a book on he calls it $1 Million Consulting, $1 Million Consultant. He now consults to consultants like me. I've been mentored by one of his people. He writes books, how to get business, how to consult, writing books, etc. I went to one of his sessions, and he's down in Rhode Island, which is not too far from the Boston area. He came up. I was right near Logan Airport. We went to a meeting, and there was a gal that got up and said, I gave my customer 10 recommendations, and he only did one. Alan said, did he pay you? She said, yeah. And he said, you're upset that you didn't do it? She said, well, yeah. He says, stop looking for unconditional love. Okay. Now, Alan is also a psychologist. Do not go into a meeting expecting to be liked, wanting to be liked. Example, I go into a meeting. I'm running the meeting. It's a 1-hour meeting, and our agenda is to plan a project. We have an hour. Plan whatever we can in that hour. Let's keep it short. And I've got a guy who likes the sound of his own voice. And for 10 minutes, he drones on about something they used to do and this and that. And in my head, even if unconsciously, it's saying, if I stop him from talking, he won't like me anymore. If that's what I'm basing it on, then guess what? The other X number of people in the room are looking at me saying, Jim, can you do something here? So I'm going to have to go to him and say, hey, Bob, very interesting. And right at that point, I'm interrupting. Right at that point, I'm interrupting him. And I'm saying, Bob, with all due respect, you've made your point. If there's nothing further, if you have something really important, I'll talk about other important things, we can set up a separate meeting. You want to hear him, you want to respect him, you need to stop him. And then move on. Stop worrying about being liked and worry about getting through the objectives of the meeting. I've had numerous times people just, cross their arms, they're a little bit offended. I'm not yelling at them. They get it. And very often, you said it yourself. You said that you like to talk. I don't know you very well. You're aware that you like to talk. People who like to talk know they like to talk. Or the people who have more devious things in mind, the goblins, we call them, the bullies, like to intimidate. And we try to shut them down as well. So everything from the innocuous, the people who like to talk, the people who go off on tangents, you must control that situation. Stop worrying about being liked. Start worrying about meeting the objectives. Because I'm going to tell you, if you come at a series of meetings and your boss says, what were the result of these meetings? Well, I couldn't finish it because of this and that. Your boss may say, yeah, he's a pain. Or he might say, aren't you in charge of the meeting? Because guess what? I would. If you work for me, I'm going to say, you better learn how to run that meeting. So stop worrying. And in fact, I'll close this on one thing. Alan Weiss, I subscribed to his newsletter. Coincidentally, this week, one of the things was, I forget the exact quote, I put it in a slide presentation I'll be doing, was about being liked or not being liked. Out of nowhere, I haven't seen him in 10 years, about that very thing. And I put it into there about that. He says, leaders don't worry about that. That is not their thing. We're not trying to be disliked, but that is not the primary thing. I don't think Jeff Bezos is sitting there do my people like me? They probably don't. They may not. He's not really worried about that. He's worried about the customer, servicing the customer. He's got other problems and whatnot, but they're worried about servicing the customer. I'm not worried about going to a meeting and having people like me. It's just wrong. So save yourself the $30 or 30 quid or whatever in the book if you want, and do that. And it's going to be hard at first, but you have to do it. And if they come up afterwards and say, you cut me off, yes, I did. I had to because we had to get to the meeting objectives. Do that. Practice that. Practice being large and in charge and not being liked. Your meetings will be better.
Yeah, it's great. It's one of the things I've heard about before is with that sort of scenario where, and I think it elevates in this remote environment, hybrid environment as well, is the fact that if you've got a dominator in the room and you've got people, so that dominator will dominate and overtalk some people, you've got to be really conscious of. You can see it in the room, can't you? Where you've got the person trying to make the point, and you've got the high D just talking over the top of them, or the high I,
right?
And the person who kind of, well, they talked over me, I'm not going to say anything, and they're looking at their desk or whatever they're starting to do,
right?
And you go, Jim, can you just finish that point you were making, trying to make whatever,
right?
Or you stop the other person and say, can so finish. When they're remote, you don't immediately pick up on. Especially if they've not got video on, you won't pick up on that person going down like that. So your attention on when people are getting cut over has to be really finer, doesn't it? You need, and that's where I think, and it's kind of we'll go into a 4-hour AI conversation if we're not careful now. The thing I've always struggled with, again, I'm a bit of a talker, be part of it. I'm a terrible note taker. Can't read my own handwriting. Always tried to find solutions for this. Got to the point where I started using OneNote and OCR recognition and stuff like that. I never quite got a solution. You know, the project manager's book that we always used to have, that we always had our notes in, that a doctor could have written mine usually. You know, it's 256 encrypted, and. So the advent of AI, the advent of products like Otter, the use of, we do it ourselves, we use Teams and let it transcribe as well at times in these meetings to allow us to capture that and be then allow you as project manager, rather than having to have, and I've had this and it doesn't work very well, having a more junior member of the team take notes, take minutes, or at one time I was very lucky that I had a PA who wasn't my PA, someone else's, but they came and took notes in the meetings. It never was quite right. And then you just get actions and the words weren't right and things like that. And AI doesn't get it right, but it gets 96% of it right, which is just as good as human, I think. How you see that kind of transform the ability to do meetings? Because one of the things you were saying about where people get lost in cyberspace or just tune out and think, oh, I should listen back to that. The ability to have a digital copy and a transcription later and trying to remember the conversations, I think is really powerful, but it's not endemic yet in doing it. And part of that's going to be CO2 storage, the amount of CO2 it's going to use for keeping all those recordings. But there's a benefit there, isn't there?
It's interesting, the AI thing. I think did you mention Otter, Otter? Yeah. Did you say that or no?
Yeah.
So
my
Otter
AI,
story,
I've used that for a while. Not so much for meetings, but just for my own
your own stuff.
Transcription, for when I write ideas as I'm going for a walk.
It's interesting because here's my own AI stories. First of all, the world is sort of before and after ChatGPT, which came out last November, and sort of all of a sudden it'd been there, and all of a sudden that was the tipping point. I was asked to 3 or 4 months ago by one of my colleagues to information interview with a guy who wanted to get into project. I do this all the time. I mentor people. People want to talk. I'll talk to anybody about getting into project management. A woman from the UK spoke to me 2 weeks ago. We spoke. Yeah, we just do it, right? So I gave him a Zoom, and he came in, and it popped up and said Otter ATI, which I'd never heard of. And what is that? Okay, whatever. So we're talking about his potential career and other stuff. Some of it's confidential. It ends, and then it comes up and says, your Otter AI is ready. And for those who aren't aware of it, it does recording and it does transcription and whatnot. I said, what is this? So I had to create an account to find out, and it was recording everything we said. And I wrote to the guy and I said, did you record? I don't know what this is. Did you record it? He said, I never heard of it. And
it's Google, isn't it? It's Google Meet. So sometimes it's Google has got some. I know that although I've got Otter, I think maybe if it was through a Google Meet, it might have done it through and offered it through that.
Just spontaneous. No, it was Zoom because it was my meeting. In fact, he couldn't have triggered it through my meeting. So we went back and forth. He says, I don't know what you're talking about, and I contacted Otter to let them know. And the other thing was, I said to him, we have laws here. You can't record me without my consent. You can't, and in different states have different laws. I think he was in Connecticut. It was a two-way street. Either one of us. So I said, you can't do that. That was my first thing with that. Interestingly, there's no reason for me not to use it. I don't really need it. I tend to get my notes other ways. But here's an interesting tidbit for you. Today, Rich and I, my colleague who wrote the book, had a Zoom meeting, which I sent him, because we're putting together a presentation on this very topic for PMI. As I went into Zoom, it added an AI app today. Came up at the bottom of the screen. I barely had a chance to look it up. Just letting you know and your viewers know. Rich didn't get it yet, so they might be rolling out slowly. It's some kind of AI app that pops up right at the bottom, right where it says camera and share screen, right in the middle there. So there is now one built in. If you go into Bing, it's there. Other AI story that's interesting that's not about meetings, but I think your listeners and viewers might find of interest. Rich teaches at Boston University, my alma mater, and he's a master lecturer there. And he invited me into a conference he had a few months ago to host a session with 3 or 4 people to discuss project management offices or something like that. And one of the sessions was about AI, because that's the big thing. And 2 of the professors got up and talked about the use of ChatGPT specifically. They might have used, what's the other one? Bard. And they experimented. They asked the AI tool to, here's what it was. They were using a scholastic thing. Students wanted to have a party. It was a fake thing. Students wanted to have a party. And they have X amount, Y, Z amount of money. And they said to ChatGPT, give us some options for the type of parties we might do. Well, ChatGPT here's the good news. ChatGPT came back with a weighted WEIGHTED table of the various options of what it would cost and the best one of those three, whether to have a boating thing or a drinking, whatever it might have been, right? Those various options. It even created a charter. It created all these great artifacts that you and I would have to churn out over. I've written how many charters? Dozens of, and it would churn that out. That was the good news. The bad news is, and I know I'm veering from meetings, but it's important. The earned value numbers were wrong. For those of you who don't know, earned value is a technique largely used in the government here in the States, other places as well, to gauge performance. You have to use math, dollar math. It calculated the numbers dead wrong. So they had to go back and calculate the numbers right. So ChatGPT got it partially right and partially wrong. And in my own experiences with AI, I have asked it questions where it can't. One of them was something about George Lucas and Star Wars. Oh, you know what it was? It was, I said to it, where did the name Indiana Jones come from? I could have Googled that. I was curious. It said, well, he went to school in Indiana. And I looked it up. George Lucas never went to school anywhere but California. Ever. At any point in time. Ever. And I went back and said, you're wrong. He said, oh, sorry about that. So take AI with it right now with a grain of salt. It's new. We fear it, but it's new. Relatively.
It's the same as using Google, though, isn't it? You Google something, you check it on Wikipedia. You have to. Anything you get on Facebook, anything there, you have to have that level of skepticism on there. And I think the tool is using those sort of tools for absolutes is not a good idea. Anything other than an expert is a bad idea to take. And even then, some of that they might have us alternating.
To your point, if I was using Otter AI, I bet if you said, I think it's a good idea if we do X, and if it heard you say, I don't think it's a good idea, and I publish it, what is Nigel saying? He doesn't like this idea, and there's a furor of something that you never said. So I'm leery. I like the idea of minutes, but maybe I'm old-fashioned. I'd still rather take it myself or vet them. Well, I got my own little notes and do that. Right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of. I think on things like that where you've got decisions, and the minutes are
lightly.
So yeah, I would say with the decisions, you need to look at those and go, we've decided this. Okay, have we? Let's go back, because you go back to that bit of writing, you listen to the recording, and you can hear what it says, and you can edit it and correct it or whatever. I think that it's because I've used it for some of my writing to be able to record, quickly transcribe, and then pop it in. And I've used words transcription as well. And it's just an interesting one, because I do think it's one of those things that it does, as project managers, you do end up being the note taker, and there is that concept of he who has the pen has the power in the meeting.
Right.
But actually, he who has the pen or she who has the pen isn't necessarily in the meeting, because you're trying to listen to everything rather than process and contribute, and that makes it really hard.
We talk about that. We talk about having a scribe. I'm going to get the person that I trust. Anybody. Shouldn't say trust. Go to trust. Mary, I'm always using Mary and Joe. Mary, would you mind taking notes so I can focus on the things that you talked about, which are somebody talks over somebody else? And wait a minute, somebody was trying to make a point there, and then she's not writing that down, but she's writing the minutes for me, and we go over those at the end. So if at all possible, it's good to have a scribe. That's always been the case, I felt, for quite a while now, if you possibly can. Timekeepers, you can be the timekeeper yourself. Timekeeping is very important. That goes along with I'm usually pretty good at that, where I say, 15 minutes left, and they look at me and grumble. Say, you can grumble all you want, but there's still 15 minutes left. Because now you've grumbled, now there are 14 minutes left, right? Because people, here's the thing. When you do work with people, if it's a half-hour meeting, whatever you're doing, exercises, the time goes like this. And so they spend 10 minutes figuring what they're going to do, and they've got 20 minutes left if you're doing some exercise and whatnot, or some discussion. You have to keep that thing moving along. You have to be a good timekeeper. There's a balancing act there, and I think running meetings involves emotional intelligence, knowing yourself, how you come across, read the room, how are people feeling, have your agenda, be large and in charge. Don't worry about being I'm not saying fix all these things at the same time, but if your meetings right now stink, and you want to get them better, do your own retrospective. Figure out what's not going well, and figure out one thing to fix. Fix that, then fix another thing. caveat. I think I mentioned this to you pre-call, Nigel. If you're working in a toxic environment, or the person that's the goblin, the bully, whatever, is 3 levels above you, or you're working in a family-run organization and the brother-in-law or the sister-in-law is giving you a hard time, these are harder. They may not be solvable in the same way. So if it's a VP 3 levels up, I might go to my sponsor and say, somebody from such and such organization is disrupting my meetings. I've tried to control it, and maybe the sponsor or my boss has to step in. Just don't try to solve every problem if you're the project. I have too many project managers as a consultant or my students who are afraid to escalate. If I escalate, my boss will think less of me. Well, if you don't escalate and things go south, he'll think even less of you. When's the right time? You're a manager, I think, of people. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Is it fair to say? I'll turn the question back to you. Would you prefer that your people never escalate to you and always solve all their problems? Or are there times when they should escalate?
No, because
what's your fine line?
The thing is you have seen the situation where people haven't escalated, they've tried to solve it, and they've got to the point where it's, or they don't need to escalate actually. Coming to me to sound out an approach to deal with the situation isn't an escalation. So if they come to me and say, right, I've got this person, he works in that area, it's been a right pain in the arse this meeting, I've tried this, I'm going to try this. What does that sound like? Because I'm there to support them, to mentor them in ways to do it, and be that sounding board. And then I might actually say, don't worry about that, I'll have a word with them. Do you know what I mean? I may take that on board. Giving me the opportunity to, because it could be one of those things, I know you mean, I know they're a pain in the backside, I need to have a word with them, but I need to have a specific word with them because I've dealt with them before, maybe, and I've seen that happen. But again, I think the other point there is also seeking advice, because if you go there, I've tried everything that I can think of, boss, in trying to solve this situation of this person, this. I may come up with another tactic. I may also, quite often, I'll sit there and go, well, let's, because I've been more removed, let's sit to the side and think about where they're coming from. What's the problem they've got? What is it are they just an arse? Or have they got a problem that we're not addressing and therefore we need to address them? Is it something else that my team member doesn't know about that I know about? It can be all manner of things, and I think the answer is always go to your boss, but don't just go, I don't know what to do, I've not tried anything. Because that's not what you expected.
I was going to call that out. You don't
just go there. Help! I don't know what to do.
Right.
You've gone, and I don't believe in this thing. Come to me with solutions, not problems. Because I don't give a damn if you've got the solution. Really, go and implement it. That's fine. I don't. Why waste their time telling me the good thing that's going to happen when they've already worked it out? It's when that's what we're there for. Is to help when they're stuck.
Right.
And sometimes it's just perspective that helps that.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's absolutely, you've got to do something completely different and be an escalation up through the trees.
Yeah, I think you said it right, because if they came to you and said, I haven't tried anything yet, I thought I'd throw it in your lap. I probably did that in my early days as a project manager, because let's put it this way. You learn that one because you have enough people who are bosses say, you go figure it out, or come back when you've tried a couple of things. Oh, I guess I didn't handle that the right way. So yeah. I would want that as well, and I think most people would want that. But in the meeting situation, you have to know when you can address it, try to address it. And again, if it's that VP who everybody knows is a problem and he's coming to your meeting, well, at least you have the tools of the things we talked about. Maybe he's going to a lot of bad meetings. Maybe come to your meeting and say, wait a minute, I was ready for a real confrontation. Jim's got an agenda. He's running this meeting. Maybe he's pissed off because he's never getting to the point where he's getting anything that he really needs. Maybe because a meeting, maybe you're the one meeting where he's getting what he needs, and it's like it's a breath of fresh air. He spent all day in meetings, which, by the way, I think I mentioned to you, maybe it was offline, I can't remember now. Rich came up with a graphic, too late to put in our book, that showed the effect of back-to-back meetings. I worked at one place with a back-to-back, not me, but other people, and they showed the brain getting more and more stress as it was like that. So space them out if you can. There's things that can be done instead of this fatalistic, all meetings are bad attitude.
Well, I think part of the back-to-back meeting thing also is some people see it as a badge of honour.
Yeah, I would have
Yeah,
meeting
it's
all
kind of,
day. Yeah.
I'm in back-to-backs. I'm so
How
important.
important am I?
Yeah. And that means I haven't got any of the work done that you want me to do, and I've got to sit there in front of TV and watching MasterChef, where they're really good at timing meetings and giving you doing your approvals for your expensive or whatever. Do you know what I mean? There is that kind of bravado of thinking that.
Right.
Whereas I'm not a paragon of virtue, but I've got big blocks of time in my diary saying "sod off." I'm doing stuff.
Right, I'm reading mail. I worked at one
I'm
place
eating
where they
lunch.
had those. I worked at one place where they had those back-to-back meetings. They were Scrum Masters, some years ago before I'd really gotten into Agile. And two people, one woman had actually brought me into the company from a class I taught. Two Scrum Masters, and they would have back-to-back meetings on the phone all day. So they had a cafeteria, and we'd go to the cafeteria. And what they would do, I'd go up there. I was a contractor, and I'd eat. They'd go up, get their lunch, go right back to their desk and work. And I came to realize it was the culture of that place. I wouldn't do it. I didn't do it. I said, I'm not going to do that. They just went back to ate at their desk. And I didn't know if that was because I think they just got the idea somewhere in there that that's what one does. And if one wants to get ahead. And then it becomes this corporate thing where it's like, why am I doing this nutty thing? Just because everybody around me is doing different topic. But again, they were in back-to-back meetings. I could see the effect on them. And I think scientifically they've proven that that's not a good thing.
No. It's bonkers. It's bonkers to be like that.
Time in the schedule is good.
Yeah, you've got
so many good things.
And the more senior you get up in the organisation, the more I see it in organisations. And the more I look at that and I think those are the people you don't want in back-to-back meetings. What you want them is, I don't care whether they're sitting in a yoga position or they're sat in a meeting room with a whiteboard, strategizing and thinking about 10 years hence for your organisation, and being blue screen. That's where they should. How do we leverage this organisation that far ahead? Not that tactical stuff of dealing with what's going on today. But that's just
and to that point, the people that we go to, I worked for a chief technology officer for about a year and a half, and you better have a good story when you went in his office. I remember two things. I worked for Lotus Development once. It was a good place to work many years ago, and I had a boss there who was a senior manager, and he was my boss's boss. My boss, I went to him and I knocked on his door, and he said, "This better be good." I don't remember what the topic was anymore, so I told him whatever it was. We resolved it. Later, maybe in the same year, I went took my family to Disney in Orlando, Florida. And I ran into him at the airport bar. "Hey, Jim, how's it going?" He was a completely different fellow, of course.
Yeah.
He was a completely different fellow, but he was being in the business mode. So we have to realize that when we go to these people, like you said, to go back what you said, you want people to have tried something. I want to make sure that I have the best use of their time. If I scheduled a half-hour meeting with this chief technology officer, if I can get it done in 10 minutes, he would be very happy. 20 minutes back in his schedule, or he would cut it short or do whatever he could to do that. So I think it's important. To your point about those people thinking, and I talked about how, Zoom fatigue, and we talked about people's ability to move around. Steve Jobs was famous for taking long walks. If you ever read the Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson about Steve Jobs, he's recently written a book about Elon Musk, which I'm not going to read, but I read the Steve Jobs one, and Jobs would say, "Come take a walk with me." And they would take long walks. He would strategize. And, whatever you want to say about Jobs, how many industries was he significant in? 5, 6, 7? Yeah. So, taking those walks, moving around. How many times do we have the aha moment in the shower or whatever? I take walks. Unfortunately, I don't have the inspirational things, but I get out of my own head for a while and do that. Get some fresh air. So I think it's important for people to decompress a little bit, and I think they don't do that. So there's so many things that are psychological, as I think about it, as you and I talk about it, around running the meeting that have less to do with the grunt work of the meeting and more to do with attitude and, like I said, emotional intelligence. We could talk for an hour about that. You reading the room. When I became an Agile coach, we would say you should know what happened in the room before you entered the room. What were the dynamics going on there? And that's true of any kind of a meeting, I think, whether it's teaching or anything else. There's so much to it. And I think we are losing. The numbers aren't as good on the success of projects as they should be. I remember when Agile came along, and the Agilists treated it like it was the panacea. And now I find them arguing about things all the time. I said, well, I guess it wasn't. But I know
Yeah.
this. I know this. Agile has a lot of meetings. And I know now that they're being run by people who may or may not know how to run meetings. So I think it's important on either side of the equation to do that. But I would tell your listeners and viewers, any kind of a retrospective is good. Looking back and saying, what did we do well? What did we not do so well? What's the one thing we can improve in our next sprint? Or again, if you're running meetings and something happened in the meeting, you go back and say, what's the one thing I could improve on that meeting? Did I have an agenda? Did I have the right people there? Did I control the meeting? Let me improve that one thing. And then they're not going to clamor to come to your meeting and carry you out on their shoulders, but they'll not dread the thought of your meeting.
Yeah, that would make
Hopefully
a
they're
difference.
pretty well run. Yeah.
Well, I've just spotted that we're coming up on an hour and a quarter. We've been talking about this,
Oh, okay.
and it's a fascinating subject, and there's probably another 2 or 3 hours we could carry on talking about it. I'm sure. I'm sure if people want to find out more. I know there's loads of you've got loads of content yourself. There's the book itself. Remind us what it's called again. It is. I'm trying to find it. I can't remember. Where's my list that says the title?
Great meetings build great teams, and it's a guide for project leaders and Agilists. Amazon, the usual places. There's a Kindle version. There's a print version. Rich and I have talked about an audio version, but that's another project. Only not that many people have requested it, but it's very much of a nuts and bolts how to run a meeting. It is not lofty. It is not academic. I have to pull Rich away from the academic because he is an academic. So we try to make a brief handbook, a couple hundred pages, on how to run a meeting. If you adopt a couple of the techniques, you're ahead of the game, I think. Something about the science of it and whatnot. So it's good stuff.
Brilliant. And if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
They can. I'll give you my email address. They can email me if they want. I don't care. It's
cool.
JStewart. So JSTEWART at JPStewart Consulting, JPSTEWART Consulting.com. That's my professional email. I'm fine. I'll talk to people, email them, whatever. You know, you and I talked about that. We mentor people. We talk to people. People don't tie me down for months at a time. They ask a question or two and they move on. So if I can be of help, that'd be great.
Brilliant. Well, Jim, thank you so much for giving me so much time and such an interesting, fascinating talk. There's a few things in there. I think I need to apply some retrospective to some of my meetings as well again, and kind of start thinking about that attention around all the people who are in that meeting. The meetings I've had today that I know that I'm going to rethink about how and reframe how I might have done them, and maybe give some advice to some others.
Fix one thing. If you're thinking 5 things, fix 5 things. But if you try to fix 5 things, you might say, I can't fix them all, I'll fix none. If the worst thing that happened was it ran over or they all ran over, try to fix that.
Yeah, that's it. Right. Ideal. Brilliant. Well, have a wonderful rest of your day, and it's good to speak to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nigel. Take care.
Thank you.